Thank you everyone for joining this session. This is Research Bytes Galaxies 1. I'll be your moderator. I'm Nushkia, and Remy is also a moderator. He'll be sharing the slides, and you need to tell him when you go next. I will be keeping time. So the speakers for our session, we have 5 speakers. I don't want to pronounce your names wrong, but I put here on the slide the talks, and you can see that we have some very a variety of talks about clusters, about neural networks, cluster assembly, dwarf galaxies, and also some morphology classification. Next slide, please, Remy. And as a reminder for the workshop itself, there's a code of conduct. So I hope all of you read it, and please abide by those rules. And of course, if you make any comments, please don't discriminate against race, gender, etc. And if you witness or see any form of harassment, please report according to the instructions. Next slide, please. And also a reminder that all of the sessions in this workshop is recorded. All the questions for this particular session, please put it on the Zoom chat. Remy and we would look at them in this chat here. I don't think you can upvote questions on the Zoom chat, but we will try to answer as much questions as possible at the end of all the talks. And I think from that, we can start already with the first speaker. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Nushkia. So under our current understanding of how star clusters form and evolve, we expect a close connection between the properties of the star clusters we observe today, their ages, metallicities, and masses, and the formation and assembly histories of their host galaxies. And due to the unprecedented volume and depth of LSST, the survey will observe hundreds of thousands, if not a million, extragalactic star clusters. So the question is how, that I've been working on, is like how well can we constrain these age, metallicities, and masses using the photometry from LSST? Next, please. So I've combined our estimates of what the photometric uncertainties will be for LSST and its various bands with stellar population models to predict what the photometry of a star cluster of a given properties would be. Next, please. And combine this together in an MCMC analysis to estimate these derived properties. So shown here are 2 corner plots on the left for an intermediate metallicity old star cluster, and then on the right, a solar metallicity younger cluster. And with going from top to bottom in these corner plots, the posteriors of metallicity, age, mass, and extinction. The blue lines show the input values to these simulations. And while we do a very good job, on constraining the metallicity and mass at the sort of 0.2, 0.1 dex level, the uncertainty in the age isn't as good, especially at older ages. We do a good job at younger ages, and certainly can tell these 2 different ages of star cluster apart. So I'm working through various combinations of cluster brightness, age, metallicity, to understand what constraints we're going to get for star clusters and globular clusters, and star clusters at different distances, and also looking to how adding data from other surveys such as Euclid is going to improve these constraints. Thank you.
Great, that was perfectly on time. Thanks. Next speaker.
Hi, good afternoon from New Jersey. My name is Adam Broussard, and I am a graduate student at Rutgers University working under Professor Eric Geweiser. And I'm excited to be able to share some of the results of my recent research with you on the topic of selecting galaxies with the most accurate photometric redshifts using a neural network classifier. So our goal with this is that we'd be able to essentially select galaxy samples that will maximize the cosmological information gained in a large-scale structure analysis. So for our analysis, we make use of two data sets. The first is the HyperSuprime Public Data Release 2, and the second is Cosmos 2015. And in particular, we use the large compilation of spectroscopic redshifts that are available in HSC PDR2 to do an initial redshift fit using a random forest algorithm called TPZ, or trees for photo-Z. We then use the reported redshifts and uncertainties from TPZ along with the same photometric information to train a neural network classifier, and it generates a confidence value for each galaxy that its redshift error is less than 0.1. Next slide, please. So a typical large-scale structure analysis would involve fitting the redshifts for all the galaxies in the sample. You split your sample into tomographic redshift bins, and you calculate the angular power spectra. But uncertainties in photometric redshifts can cause galaxies to scatter into neighboring bins, or in catastrophic cases, go to a distant redshift bin. So here we can see that using our neural network classifier to select down to about 30% of the original sample allows us to greatly reduce the outlier fraction and the standard deviation, as well as the normalized median absolute deviation. And the legacy survey of space and time is going to make a selection like this possible because of the overwhelming galaxy statistics available. Next slide, please. All right, so rather than selecting a particular sample size, this actually shows the trade-off between sample size and each of the three accuracy metrics I mentioned before. Because we want each of these metrics to be as low as possible, with the largest possible selected sample up and to the left is an improvement. And here you can see that we've made selections using the reported uncertainties from TPZ in black, or a selection using the Gaussianity parameter for the photo-Z PDF in gray. But the best of the three typically is the blue curve, which is our neural network classifier, particularly when you're selecting less than half of the sample. It's actually a pretty significant improvement over TPZ. These labeled values here are the confidence values from the neural network classifier. So you can go to the next slide. All right, so this is a new method for selecting galaxy photo-Zs, and our next steps are to apply this to Rubin data to improve cosmological precision. Please reach out to me if you'd like to know more.
Great, thank you. Simona?
Hi, I am Simona Mei, and I recently joined the collaboration. I will present my work and the work of my students and postdocs within the CARLA collaboration, and we speak about the first epochs of cluster assembly. So galaxy clusters are predicted to form a redshift 1 to 2.5 at the merging of group progenitors. And on the bottom right, you can see the predictions from numerical simulations for the mass evolution of the main progenitors of three kinds of local clusters. The CARLA survey provides a unique homogeneous sample of 16 confirmed galaxy clusters, a redshift between 1.3 and 3, with the total mass consistent with those of local class progenitors, as you can see in the rectangle, in the yellow rectangle on the right. Spitzer HST ground-based imaging enabled us to derive galaxy morphology, mass, star formation rates, and to separate passive from active galaxies. Next, please. Main result is that the galaxies in CARLA clusters are still significantly going through quenching and morphological transformations, so that on the left you see the passive fraction in CARLA clusters compared to the field, that is candles. And you can see that only 50% of our clusters have average fractions that are consistent with local clusters, while the other ones are still transforming. And on the right, you see the spheroid fraction, so the morphological transformation always compared to candles. And you see that only 30% of our clusters have spheroid fraction that are consistent with local clusters. Next, please. In one of the clusters, at zeta 1.44, we also found a large molecular gas reservoir around the GN ATG host with still star forming. So the ATG has not yet quenched. And on the other end, the cluster star forming galaxies have star formation rates that are below the field main sequence at R quenched. Next, please. So lots of transformations, and Rubin observations, when combined with longer wavelength observation from other surveys, can be used to detect the local cluster progenitors at Z larger than 1.3. And at these epochs, cluster galaxies go through major morphological transformations and quenching, so that the future large area surveys would permit us to pinpoint this transformation on large scales and different environments.
Thank you very much, Simona. That was really on time. And our next speaker, Elizabeth.
Hiya. Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth Noakes-Kettel. I'm in the first year of my PhD at the University of Hertfordshire. My project is currently looking at the dwarf galaxy mass function in simulations and observations, and looking how the faint end varies with environment. So dwarf galaxies are important to study because they dominate the number density, but dwarfs outside the local group are largely invisible in past surveys, as demonstrated by the plot where the red line shows the surface brightness limit of SDSS, and all of the galaxies below that from the simulation would be invisible. So the missing dwarfs problem is a mismatch between the theoretical and observational dwarf mass functions in Lambda CDM, where the simulations seem to overpredict the number of dwarf galaxies in past surveys. Some studies suggest that this is not a problem in the local group, but this doesn't mean we can't look at it at cosmological distances. So in order to study this, we need a high resolution cosmological simulation, like the New Horizons simulation, and deep wide surveys complete in the dwarf regime, and we demonstrate some results with HSC SSP data. Next slide, please. We also use Disperse to create density maps and cosmic web skeletons for redshift slices in HSC Cosmos, and we demonstrate some results for mass functions constructed from pointings taken within a redshift slice, shown here at about Z equals 0.2. Next slide, please. So we want to look at some key features of the mass function, such as the slope and the normalization. And we define this, the density regions, by the nodes, filaments, and voids, where nodes would be characteristically much denser regions than the voids. One key result is that the dwarf to giant ratio, actually, we don't see much of a trend here, whereas some literature suggests that we should see an increase in the dwarf to giant ratio in denser regions. This could just be because of the absence of rich clusters in the field that we're looking at. Next slide, please. Just as a summary, so new deep wide surveys such as LSST can offer us statistical samples of dwarf galaxies outside our local neighborhood. And if we combine this with the cosmological simulations, then we can look at this in unprecedented detail. We see that the slope of the mass function becomes steeper with local density, but the dwarf to giant ratio does not show a strong correlation with environment. And some forthcoming work, we'd like to study this up to about redshift of 0.5, and we'd like to make predictions for the dwarf mass function at high redshift for comparison to surveys from future instruments, such as Reuben Observatory, LSST, and GWST.
Okay, Elizabeth, your time is up. We'll have to move on. No, that's fine. Thank you so much. And our final speaker, Brant, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Brant Robertson. I'm a professor here at UC Santa Cruz. I'm the former chair of the Galaxy Science Collaboration as well. Today, I'm going to tell you just a little brief bit about how we do pixel level morphological classification with some software called Morpheus, which is a deep learning framework for pixel level classification of astronomical images. So a PhD student in computer science here named Ryan Housen has developed this software, which is a convolutional neural network based model to take images, astronomical images, the actual data itself, multi-band data. The framework takes that data and then at the pixel level tells you what's in the image. So it goes pixel by pixel, scanning through the image. Every pixel gets a classification. That classification is some number between 0 and 1 that tells you a model likelihood for what class that pixel belongs to. That class could be a sky background pixel. You don't care about it. If you do care about it, some flux pixel, then that pixel gets a classification of being spheroid, disk, irregular, or a point source, a compact object. Because the framework identifies what pixels are sky and which ones are not, it also does detection of sources. And then it can produce what's called a classification map that tells you, like you see on the far right, a colorized annotated image of the scene that you provided, where every pixel has some indication about whether or not that pixel belongs, say, to a disk galaxy or a star or what have you. So if you just compare, the image on the far left and on the far right, I think you can agree that the model does a good job of annotating these images. This work has been published in AppJ supplement series as a code paper. Next slide, please. So we've taken Morpheus now and we've done classification of every single pixel in the major HST extragalactic survey. So the candle survey is also the dash imagery in Cosmos. So we've classified billions of pixels with HST now. And the model works extremely well. It's well parallelized. It can run on multiple GPUs at once, so you can scan through these images very quickly and produce classifications. Of course, now with Reuben, we'll have gigapixel images of 10 square degrees at a time, and that's a significant challenge. But given the way that hardware is advancing, and also the way the software and algorithmic changes are advancing, we're pretty confident this can be done. Next slide. So what are we doing now? So we're working with the DP0 to try to integrate Morpheus with the Rubin Science Platform. So the Rubin Science Platform, if you haven't used it before, has a Jupyter notebook-based interface with the data. You can actually bring up images, the simulated images from DP0, into your notebook. And so now what we're doing is then adding Morpheus as a classification layer on top of those images so that we can get annotated pixel level annotations to the input data. So the hope is that we can provide this as a service to other people who are interested to, in these very large images, to know exactly what the galaxies and stars in those images are and where they are and what kind of galaxy they are.
Great.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the speakers for keeping well on time. We have not got any questions yet in the chat. If anybody wants to ask a question, I think you can. I'm not sure if the participants can unmute themselves, but you can either type it or speak if you can unmute yourself. We have 10 minutes for discussion, so because all our speakers kept on time.
Let me start. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, of course. Go ahead.
Thomas.
Yeah.
Hi. Question for Chris. So what are the underlying models that you're using for your experiments?
So I've been using the flexible stellar population synthesis models by Charlie Conroy and others. And the model ingredients I've been using are the MIST isochrones, the Millet's stellar libraries supplemented by the Basel stellar libraries. I've done some work trying to find ages of Glover clusters in a number of galaxies using the same set of models and optical photometry, and the models seem to reproduce certainly the GRIZ colors of Glover clusters with known properties from spectroscopy. A little bit more uncertain about what the U band, much less the Y band, is doing, but there is a lot of work still to do to test how well this works.
Great. So we have a question from Saha. Saha, do you want to unmute yourself and ask, or do you want me to read it? Okay, so Saha asked to Adam, up to what redshift the photo Z measurements are correct with your new neural network method?
Yeah, good question. So our current analysis focuses on Z less than 1.5 because that's the kind of the sweet spot for the UGRI-ZY bands to be able to get good redshifts, because that's the range over which you can get a good detection of something like the 4,000 angstrom break and those sorts of spectral features. So we haven't explored higher than redshift of 1.5, but this method should work just as well at higher redshift. It just may exclude a larger number of galaxies because photo-Zs will naturally become less certain once you start going towards those higher redshifts, and those large spectral features kind of redshift out of those filters.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to know if you also had included dwarfs in your sample, and did you see any difference it makes in getting the photo Z?
So we haven't made a selection that disfavors dwarves, but we haven't specifically done an analysis on dwarves themselves. So maybe that could be something that we would add to our analysis in the future, is a comparison of how many galaxies or what fraction of galaxies are retained for high mass versus low mass galaxies or something like that.
Thanks.
Any more questions to our speakers?
Ask another question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead if no one else has one.
To Brant. So very nice to see the pixel level morphological classification. I just, I mean, maybe I should look at the paper, but if you don't mind telling, like, what's the key difference you find if you look at the spiral versus an elliptical, just the pixel distribution? Do you look at the pixel distribution in galaxy classes?
Yeah, certainly, yeah. So it depends on which band you look in, obviously. So there's just the flux distribution is different. The surface brightness profiles are different. We train the model on HST-based imagery, which is quite detailed. And right now, what we're doing is we're trying to transfer learn to the HSC data. Because if we apply this to Reuben, Reuben's imagery has a different pixel distribution for the objects than, say, the HST data does. So you do have to retrain on data that is comparable to get good performance. The DP0 objects only have smooth surface brightness profiles. They don't have any structure at all. But we found, and if you look at the paper, we found that just simple Sursic profile models, the model does a very good job of separating out spheroids and disk galaxies, just because the Sursic N is different. You have exponentials versus the Boca-Lore-like surface brightness profiles. The model does a good job of picking those out, even without structure in the galaxies themselves. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Basically, I mean, a year ago, I tried to do just the pixel distribution, just not the flux, between different model galaxies. And I was wondering whether you take a randomly select pixels from within your galaxy boundary, or you take all the pixels, or does it make difference in that?
We take all the pixels. Now, the pixels are usually classified many times. So the model, I didn't show an animation, the model scans through the image, and it does so with a certain stride that makes sure that every pixel is classified multiple times. And so, yeah, we look at every pixel in the image itself. We don't mask the pixels while we're doing the scanning. So every pixel in every galaxy is classified multiple times, and then we use a statistical technique to select out among the distribution of pixel classifications, pixel by pixel, what is most likely pixel classification for that single pixel. And then that's what we use to do the galaxy level classification, where we do a luminosity weighted average, say, to tell you, this galaxy is a disk galaxy or a spheroid. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thanks a lot.
So I see 2 raised hands. Jeff, you had a question, and then Simona. We have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think this is kind of an ill-formed question, but I was wondering for Elizabeth, I was wondering about you're discussing dwarf galaxy mass function out to redshift of 0.5. Do you know sort of, have you thought much about how observable dwarf galaxies are at those redshifts with Reuben, and especially, I guess, the sort of interplay between the quenched fraction and their detectability, because I could imagine things that are more active are going to be easier to detect.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I mean, we have to take into consideration these things, especially, I mean, hence why we're currently just looking at what kind of evolution we're going to see in like the densities as well, up to 0.5, but definitely incompleteness and sky subtraction and things like that are things that we have to consider in this. I mean, with instruments like LSST, I think that this is going to be really revolutionary. But obviously we're working with what is the kind of deepest, widest data at the moment. So yeah, that would be really interesting to see how that affects it.
Okay, in less than a minute, we have to close this first session, and then round 2 of this Galaxies 1 is going to start. So thank you to all the speakers for keeping the time, and thank you to the audience for asking questions. If you have questions, please reach out to each other through Slack, and I hope you continue the discussion. Thanks a lot.
So Nushka, do we just stay here and start?
Yes, so the speakers have to remain, and then the audience would come basically, and then we do it all over again.
Follow the other talks.
They are recorded.
Yeah,
so
that's good. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to your question, but maybe in the second.
No, it's okay.
I
had the answer by Elizabeth. She answered my question when she answered to the other question. This is why I put my hand down. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Don't worry.
Okay, great. So let's, I think maybe we need to already start, right? Yeah. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming to this session. This is Research Bytes Galaxies 1. I'm Nushkia and Remy. We are the moderators for this session. Remy will be handling the slides for the speakers. We have 5 speakers today, and they will talk about clusters, neural networks, cluster assembly, dwarf galaxies, and then we also have a talk on morphological classification. Next slide, please. If you've been following the Research Bytes, you know that you need to abide throughout the workshop by the code of conduct. Please do not discriminate anyone against their gender or race, etc. And if you witness any form of bullying, please follow the rules to report. Next slide, please. This session is recorded, as is all sessions in this workshop. Please write your questions to the speakers in the Zoom chat. There's no Slack channel for this. And by the end of the talks, we will discuss these questions. And without further delay, let's go to the first speaker. Thank you.
Hello. So under our current understanding of how star clusters form and evolve, there is a close connection between the properties of the star clusters that we observe today and the formation and assembly histories of their host galaxies. So if we can measure the properties of a large number of star clusters and a large number of galaxies, we can understand and test are models for how both star clusters and galaxies form and evolve. And with its unprecedented depth and volume, LSST will image an immense number of extragalactic star clusters, hundreds of thousands, if not a million. So the question then becomes is how well can the deep multiband photometry that LSST is going to provide constrain the properties of these star clusters? Next slide, please. So what I'm doing is combining our predictions for what the photometric uncertainties that LSST will provide together with stellar population models that predict the integrated photometry of clusters of different properties to see how well the data will constrain those properties. Next slide, please. So shown here is two corner plots of two different model star clusters. The one on the left is an intermediate metallicity old star cluster. The one on the right is a younger solar metallicity cluster. And as you go from top to bottom, you see the posterior distributions of metallicity, age, mass, and extinction, where the blue lines show the input values to these simulations. And you see that both for the old and the young cluster, we constrain the metallicity and mass very well at sort of the 0.2, 0.1 dex level. But the age uncertainty that we get for the older cluster is not exceptional. But it does provide, we do get a tight age constraint for the younger star cluster. And we can certainly tell young from old star clusters apart with the level of uncertainties that we expect from LSST. And so I've been working on testing, seeing what constraints we get at a range of different cluster brightnesses, metallicities, ages, and also exploring how these constraints are improved when we fold in data from other surveys such as Euclid. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Next speaker, Adam, thank you.
Hi, good afternoon from New Jersey. My name is Adam Broussard, and I am a graduate student at Rutgers University working under Professor Eric Geweiser. I'm excited to be able to share some of the results of my recent research with you on the topic of selecting galaxies with the most accurate photometric redshifts using a neural network classifier. Our goal is basically that we can use this method to select galaxy samples that maximize cosmological information gained. So for our analysis, we make use of two data sets. One is the HyperSubPrimeCam Public Data Release 2 dataset, and the other is Cosmos 2015. In particular, we use the large compilation of spectroscopic redshifts that are available in HSC PDR2 to perform an initial redshift fit using trees for PhotoZ or TPZ, which is a random forest redshift fitting algorithm. And we then use the reported redshifts and uncertainties from TPZ along with the same photometric information to train a neural network classifier to generate a confidence value for each galaxy that its redshift error is less than 0.1. Next slide, please. A typical large-scale structure analysis would involve fitting redshifts for all the galaxies in your sample, splitting the sample into tomographic redshift bins, and you calculate the angular power spectra for your bins. However, the uncertainties in the photometric redshifts can cause galaxies to scatter into a neighboring redshift bin, or in a catastrophic case, to even scatter into a distant redshift bin. And here you can actually see that if we perform our neural network classifier selection, that we can greatly reduce the outlier fraction, the normalized median absolute deviation, and the standard deviation by reducing our sample size down to about 30% of the original sample. And the legacy survey of space and time is going to make selections like this possible because of the overwhelming galaxy statistics available when it has photometry for billions of galaxies. Next slide, please. All right, so rather than selecting any particular sample size, this figure actually shows the trade-off between the sample size and each of the three accuracy metrics that I mentioned on the previous slide. So because we want each of these metrics to be as low as possible and we want the sample size to be as large as possible, shifting these curves up and to the left is an improvement. So we show curves here for the selections made using the reported uncertainty, which is shown in black, for zconf, which is a measure of Gaussianity in the PhotoZ PDF, And then the best of the three is the blue curve, which is our neural network classifier, which shows a really significant improvement over the other methods, particularly when selecting less than half of the sample. Next slide. All right, so here we show a new method of photo-Z selection using a neural network classifier, and we've submitted this to AppJ as Broussard and Geweiser 2021. Our next step is to apply this to Rubin data to improve cosmological precision, and I would love it if you would contact me about this on Slack or email. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam. Next speaker, please. Simona.
Hi, I'm Simona Mei. I'm professor at Université de Paris and recently joined the collaboration, and I will present my work and the work of my students and postdocs on the first epochs of cluster assembly. So galaxy clusters are predicted to form a redshift 1 to 2.5 by the merging of group progenitors. On the bottom right, you can see the predictions from numerical simulations for the mass evolution of the main progenitors of 3 kinds of local clusters. The Carla surveys provides a unique homogeneous sample of 16 confirmed galaxy clusters, a redshift of 1.323, with total mass that is consistent with those of local cluster progenitors. This is the yellow rectangle on the right. And with Spitzer HST ground-based imaging, we could obtain galaxy morphology, mass, star formation rates, and to separate passive from active galaxies. Next, please. Our main result is that galaxies in the Carla clusters are still significantly going through quenching and morphological transformations. So on the bottom left, you see the fraction of passive galaxies as compared to the candles fractions. And you see that the only 50% of our samples have fractions that are consistent with local clusters and are significantly different from the field. And on the right, you see the fraction of spheroids, so morphological transformations. In this case, only 30% of our clusters have fractions that are consistent with local clusters and significantly different from the candle sample. So most of the clusters are still going through a significant quenching and morphological transformations. Next, please. In one cluster at Z1.44, we found a large molecular gas reservoir around the GN at the GEOST, which is still star forming, so has not yet quenched as the ATG that we observe in the local universe. And on the other end, the clusters are forming galaxies have star formation rates that are below the field main sequence and are already a bit quenched. So next, please. The Rubin observations were combined with longer wavelength observations from other surveys can be used to detect the local cluster progenitors at Z1.3. These epochs, cluster galaxy go through major morphological transformation and quenching. So these future large area surveys will permit us to pinpoint this transformation on large scales. Notice that we have only tens of these objects, or a bit more of them, yeah, tens, on large scales and different environments. So it will be a significant advance in the field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona. Thank you. Next speaker, please, Elizabeth.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Noakes-Kettel. I'm in the first year of my PhD at the University of Hertfordshire. And my project is currently looking at the dwarf galaxy mass function in simulations and observations and how the faint-end varies with environment. So why is it important to study dwarf galaxies? Well, they dominate the number density of galaxies, but dwarfs outside the local group are largely invisible in past surveys, as demonstrated by this plot showing the surface brightness limit of SDSS, and all the objects below would be invisible in past surveys. So the missing dwarfs problem is the mismatch between the theoretical and observational dwarf mass functions in lambda CDM. So the simulations are said to overpredict the number of dwarf galaxies in past surveys. Some Previous work suggests that this is not a problem in the local group, but this doesn't mean that we can't look at it at cosmological distances. So in order to study this, we need a high resolution cosmological simulation like the New Horizons simulation and deep wide surveys. We demonstrate some results using HSC SSP. And next slide, please. We also use disperse to create density maps and cosmic web skeletons for redshift slices in HSC Cosmos and demonstrate some results for mass functions constructed from pointings in this field in a redshift slice of about 0.2, which is what we can see in the image here. Next slide, please. We look at some key features of the mass functions such as the slope and the normalization in varying density environments such as nodes, which would typically have higher density, and void regions, which would be the lowest. Interestingly, we don't see, as literature previously states, that there should be an increase in the dwarf to giant ratio in more dense regions. But we don't see much of a trend here, but this could just be because of the absence of rich clusters in the field that we're looking at. Next slide, please. Yes, so as a quick summary, we need these deep wide surveys like HSC and LSST if we want a statistical sample of dwarf galaxies outside the local group. And if we combine this with high resolution cosmological simulations, then we can look at the dwarf evolution in unprecedented detail. Some results suggest that the slope of the dwarf mass function becomes steeper with local density, but we don't see much of a trend in dwarf to giant ratio. And we'd like to study this out to about Z of 0.5 and make predictions for the dwarf mass function at high redshift for comparison to surveys from future instruments like Reuben Observatory, NSST, and JWST. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. We have a final speaker, Brant.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brant Robertson. I'm a professor here at UC Santa Cruz. I'm one of the former chairs of the Galaxy Science Collaboration. Today, I'm going to tell you just a very brief little bit about Morpheus, which is a deep learning framework for pixel level morphological classification of astronomical images. So a student here, a PhD student named Ryan Housen, has developed Morpheus to perform pixel level classification. So what it does is it takes science images, so FITS images or science images served by the Rubin science platform, and it feeds it into a convolutional neural network, a style of network called a UNet. That network goes pixel by pixel and classifies every pixel in the image and provides a model probability for what kind of object the pixel belongs to. That might be the sky, a background pixel, so it might be not of interest. If it is of interest, it will tell you some probability that the pixel belongs to a spheroidal galaxy, a disk galaxy, an irregular or a point source galaxy or a star. So because the model does tell you what's a sky pixel and what's not, it does do a form of object detection. And then this information can be aggregated into a classification image like what you see on the far right. So if you compare the image on the far left and on the far right, you can see pixel by pixel, there's a color on the far right that indicates what the model thinks that pixel belongs to. Blue in this case is a disk galaxy, red is spheroidal, yellow is a point source or a compact object that's difficult to classify, and green is an irregular object. Next slide. So in the original paper, we went through and we classified every pixel in the major HST extragalactic surveys that were available at the time and released those. So there are pixel level classifications for all of the candles images. We've also now done the dash imaging in Cosmos in a single H-band image. All of the candles images we classified in multiple bands. So we've done billions of pixel classifications in HST images. And we're confident that we can translate this to Reuben Observatory data. So next slide, please. So what we're doing right now is we're trying to integrate Morpheus with the Reuben Science Platform. So as part of DP0, we have access to the Reuben Science Platform and the simulated images provided by DP0, and we're adding Morpheus as an interpretive layer on top of the results from the Rubin Science platform. So if you haven't used it before, the Rubin Science platform has a Jupyter notebook-based interface to the data, so you can get the actual images through the butler, as it's called, that serves the data to you in these notebooks. And then we're integrating that with Morpheus so that then those images are classified by Morpheus. Now, the DP0 images are only smooth Cirsic profile images now. They don't have any structure, but actually Morpheus has been shown to produce pretty good classifications based on that. So we're building the framework right now to use the simulated data, and then hopefully once the real data comes online, we'll be ready to do pixel level classifications with Morpheus. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all the speakers for the talks. And now we have plenty of time for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question, or type it on the chat and I can read it. There's a raised hand. Remy, go ahead.
Yeah, it's me. I'll go ahead and kickstart this. I have a question for Chris. So in your beautiful picture that you show, since I have privileges, I can use them wisely, where you show all your clusters, and they seem to be all aggregated and on top of each other and on top of their host galaxy. How does this blending affect your measurements?
So this is an image. So this is a relatively nearby galaxy, about 23 megaparsecs away. So this image is something like 10 or 20 arc minutes on the side. So the individual globular cluster, except in the very center of the galaxy, and you might be able to see that there's a deficit of points in the very center. The clusters are not blended together with one another or with stars or galaxies, and it's, again, except in the very center, for a galaxy that has a very simple morphology, such as this elliptical galaxy, it is very straightforward to model the galaxy light or do a median subtraction, identify the clusters, and perform reliable photometry. It becomes a much more more complicated picture if you are looking at an actively star-forming galaxy with ground-based data. And certainly it's a whole nother technical challenge of how reliably can we identify star clusters in morphologically complex galaxies and reliably measure their photometry. And that is something that's going to require a lot of work, and I haven't really given much thought to.
Sounds like a fun challenge. Thanks. Sorry.
No, that's fine. There's a raised hand by Jose Antonio. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, thank you. This is for Brant. So I'm wondering if in your method there are some limitations about distant objects or the size of objects. I'm thinking more about the size in the object in the image or the brightness of the pixel in the image.
Oh, sure, there are definitely. Oh yeah, there's definitely limitations. So, so one of the things that we've been looking at in the HST data, and this will just be amplified in the ground-based data, which has poorer resolution, is how the morphological classifications degrade as you go to higher and higher redshifts. So as the objects become more compact, we have a compact class that says, basically it's an indication that we can't tell the detailed morphological structure of the object because it's too small. either it's comparable to the PSF or the scene, or it's faint enough that we only see the very brightest part of the galaxy. And so you definitely see an increase in that classification as you go by number, as you go to higher and higher redshift samples. So we do look at this in detail in the paper and the papers we're writing now in different surveys. So it's definitely a limitation, but it's a limitation, I think, for any visual classification, that if you go to faint enough objects, small enough objects, it becomes difficult to say much about their detailed morphological properties. So yes.
Okay, sorry. And do you think you can, with this method, identify, I don't know, low surface brightness structures?
Yes, we definitely see low surface brightness structures around galaxies that are part of the classification. The degree to which we can see this depends on the quality of the data, though, and how it's been reduced. So I think there are other methods for subtracting large scale backgrounds to leave behind low surface brightness features. And if the data that we receive in the model has not been processed in a way that enables that, it's going to be difficult for the model to restore that information. So this is this concern with Reuben on how the data will be processed, and it's something we'll have to look into more for sure. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
We don't have yet any more questions.
And can I respond to your comment, Nushkia?
Sure. And I think we just got a raised hand, but yeah, go ahead.
I think
Simona has a question.
Certainly looking at how approaches such as what Brant talked about of how the different codes for deblending sources and identifying sources, certainly seeing how well the various LSST, the tools for LSST that are being developed for more generic extragalactic science work is certainly a first step in doing the star cluster science. And it would be very nice if our star cluster scientists can just use what people have already written, and we don't have to do anything new. But it is sort of a different regime, looking for compact sources next to something very bright that I don't think is usually tested in a lot of the low surface brightness and source detection and morphology. There certainly is a couple galaxies in the HyperSubPrimeCam survey footprint that we can certainly test these methods with now. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Chris. And Simona, you have a question.
Yeah, the question for Elizabeth. So looking at your plots, you say that the dwarf to giant ratio doesn't change with environment. But then if you look at the alpha index, there is an increase of the dwarf galaxies in the nodes, so in the dense regions. So I'm wondering if you have looked at the spatial distributions of the dwarfs and the massive galaxies, because if the ratio doesn't change, but they increase, can it just be because in the simulation, when adding dwarf and massive galaxies in a node, they just both increase in number? But then if you can separate the very central core region of the node and the peripheral region, you might see if your mass function changes in the core because of dynamical fraction or other effects.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a really interesting thing to look into. I mean, yeah, there's definitely a variation in the literature as to how the dwarf to giant ratio does change with density, but that would be a really interesting way to separate them out.
Thank you.
Great.
May I ask this is
yes.
Charles Lidfeld.
Yes,
may I ask
go ahead.
just a general comment brought about by Adam's work about neural network classifiers with PhotoZs. I brought this up in the Galaxies 2 session briefly also. I would love to hear Adam and anybody else have a comment about how we should select the best LSST algorithms for PhotoZs coming forward. If anybody here on this group, Adam or anyone else, I think Sam showed up here from the other session too. Have any comments about that can be discussed in 30 seconds or less? Would love to hear sort of input on that idea. I know that there's a lot going on in there. I'm just interested in that idea in general.
All right, so rapid fire. I think the thing I would point to the most is, in my particular case, we're trying to select galaxies for large scale structure analysis. And so I would point to the recent desk tomographic challenge, where they essentially used their data challenge 2 simulation and invited people to try all sorts of different methods of assigning galaxies to different redshift bins and see who can get the highest signal to noise ratio. So I think that's a good place to start if you haven't seen that already. But also in my particular case, there's another graduate student in our group named Irene Moskowitz, who's going to be essentially trying out this method that I presented against the top methods of the Tomo challenge on those data sets to see how it compares. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but at least gives you maybe somewhere to look for other similar ideas.
Totally, thanks.
Yeah, I don't know. If I had to answer, I'd say the thing to keep in mind is that there is no set answer. It's going to depend a bit on your science. Like, again, choosing a specific redshift range for tomographic bins for large scale structure is very different from if you're trying to do like a measure of the luminosity function or something and you don't want to bias yourself with cuts. That's a very different problem. Or if you need a physical parameter estimate and you need that estimate to be robust, that's a very different problem than assembling a large scale structure sample where you don't really care if you lose half your galaxies and those have some systematic bias. So I think the main thing is, look at the algorithms available and know the pluses and minuses of, does this introduce any bias? Does it produce a physical parameter? Does it meet all of my needs? And go from there, because there is no one size fits all photo Z, and it makes it a pain because people think of photo Zs as monolithic and they're really not. I mean, if you want to estimate physical parameters, you can do it with machine learning, but then you're dependent on your training sets. If you do it on templates, you could introduce biases with your templates, but they tend to be more robust to extrapolation and things. So it's really dependent on the science.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much, Sam. Appreciate that.
Great. And now we've come to the end of this session. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you for all the great questions. Thank you, Remy, for handling the slides and recording the session. And I think we're off to a break. And I hope you continue the discussion through Slack. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Nushkia.
Thank you for your time.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.